On Friday, the High Court ruled that former Home Secretary Yvette Cooper's prescription of Palestine action was unlawful on two grounds. First, Cooper didn't correctly follow her own policies in prescribing the group, considering the operational advantage of the prescription rather than just the actions of the group. And second, that the prescription interfered significantly with the public's right to free speech and assembly, an interference that couldn't be warranted by Palestine actions which the court found did not meet the threshold for prescription. Now, the ban on the group remains in place while the government prepares its arguments for an appeal. But on Sunday, Yvette Cooper finally spoke, appearing on the news rounds to give her version of events. This is with Trevor Phillips on Sky.
The High Court in London this week ruled that your decision to prescribe Palestine action was disproportionate. What led you to take that decision other than the spray painting of some military aircraft? This was criminal damage, but it wasn't terrorism, was it?
Well, I followed the clear advice and recommendations, going through a serious process that the Home Office goes through, involving different agencies and police advice as well, which was very clear about the recommendation for prescription of this group. And the court has also concluded that this is not a normal protest group, that it has found that this group has committed acts of terrorism, that this group is not simply in line with democratic values and has promoted violence.
Forgive me.
The Home Secretary, let me just finish the point. The Home Secretary has appealed on the grounds on which the government lost. But look, in the end, the decision for a Home Secretary is what you always have to do, is take really seriously advice that you're given. And if you're given advice about potential risks of violence and risks to public safety, you have to take that advice very seriously.
I was given advice about risks to public safety, and I had to take that advice very, very seriously too. I took that advice, and I only took the advice, and I didn't do anything wrong myself because it was all advice, advice, advice. Yes, if you're a minister, you have to consider the advice. Nobody disagrees, but prescription and all the consequences for ordinary people's free speech that flows from it is a political act. It's not just, you're not an automaton as a minister who just has to follow the advice you're given. You have to think about it in the political context in which you're applying it or not applying it. And so it's your job to consider the political consequences of your decisions, the political consequences of taking the advice that you're now trying to blame for the decision you made. Kieran, does it seem like "it weren't me, Gov" is the only consistent messaging the Labour Party now has? We've seen it with Keir Starmer, and now we're seeing it again with Yvette Cooper.
Yeah, I mean, their sloganeering started with change, and it's descended into this. You're right, it is. It's know-nothingness. That seems to be the guiding principle of this government now, as it, 19 months into one of the largest majorities in British political history, totally fades into parody, farce, absurdity, disgrace. And the fish rots from the head, right? So it starts with Starmer saying, I knew nothing, I knew nothing. Yvette Cooper is repeating that now. But the fundamentals are clear. The advice most likely was not as they say it was. That's the first thing. And I think that points to something more serious, which is that this was totally politically motivated. It's extremely clear, I think, or increasingly clear to people, I always suspect many of us did, that the government basically broke the law to please the Israel lobby and the arms manufacturing lobby.
Yeah, I think that, sorry, I was just thinking about, I find myself so angry because I think about, obviously, as you know, I've met a lot of people who were arrested during, sign-holding protests, who Cooper seemed, on the basis of this decision, quite happy to allow their careers, their futures, their reputations to be totally tarnished by a conviction under the Terror Act. Thousands of them. And there's this thing about this government which I think happens repeatedly, which is that they make decisions without any care for the consequences for ordinary people that they have. They're only interested in what it does for the polling. So, you had the end of the winter fuel allowance, you had the retention of the two-child benefit cap, you had the attempt to cut welfare, you had the prescription of Palestine action, which had consequences even for those of us who didn't break the law, right? Or has consequences for those of us who didn't break the law, because it means that, our ability to do things is curtailed. And in fact, the chilling effect of that on normal protests that we might want to make, or legal protests that we might want to make, is also a very real thing. I just think, that for me is what epitomizes the government, a total lack of care for the people that their decisions affect or impact, and only an interest in what the newspapers are going to say or what's going to happen with the polls. Same with Peter Mandelson, like abused girls. Who cares? Let's send him to Washington.
Yeah.
Not by Peter Mandelson, incidentally. Peter Mandelson is not accused of anything like that, but by someone he described as the best pal, Jeffrey Epstein.
I mean, we have to remember that, though Gaza's not on our screens at the moment, this is a government that basically went beyond complicity in the worst genocide of the 21st century and partnered in it effectively. Profited from it, made political hay from it. And that obviously extends to the kind of activist reverberations of the genocide around the world, including the hunger strikers in this country. So I don't think, unfortunately, and I really try not to be a weathered old cynic, I really do, but there is no conclusion to draw other than that this government has a total disregard for human life of Palestinians and, indeed, a total disregard for human life of its own citizens. I've met one of the hunger strikers, and the consequences of all of this on them will last their entire lifetime, regardless of what happens with their trial. And yet, it's already been deemed unlawful, Palestine Action being proscribed as a terror organisation, and as I say, clearly this was done for narrow political, short-term reasons and benefits. That will go. The physical and mental and psychological scars that this period of time in prison or persecution from the state will last these people a lifetime.
Yeah, I think that's what makes me so angry about the kind of her argument of, I just took advice, and Starmer's argument, which is the same. And you said there, the fish rots from the head, right? And it's the brass neck of Cooper making the exact same argument. And I guess, if the fish does rot from the head, then yeah, the brass neck comes next. The advice that Cooper could prescribe, not had to, just could, was not really very compelling anyway, and based on 3 out of nearly 400 Palestine actions, a point that the High Court picked up. That's less than 1% of the group's activities. That interview went on.
I'm not inviting criticism of you, but clearly the advice that you were given by the police, by the intelligence services, didn't stack up for, if you like, what the courts call the reasonable person, and certainly the judges in this case. Do you think that there's something that we need to look at in the way that the kind of advice that you and other Home Secretaries get?
Well, the current Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, has looked again at this and looked at both the judgment of the court and also the advice that she is being given. And she's been clear that she disagrees with this decision, and that is why the Home Office is appealing. So, look, this is going to go to appeal, so that will mean that there will be another chance for the legal system to consider this. But I really just say, when you're faced with advice around public safety threats, it's really important to take those seriously. And I think you and everybody else would expect Home Secretaries to take very seriously the advice about public safety, the advice about threats to be taken very seriously.
It is completely unclear and unknown what advice about threats to the public she's referring to there. What those threats even are, and it's not the first time Yvette Cooper has done this, where she's resorted to vague gestures of imminent danger and secret knowledge, rather than simply taking responsibility for a mistake or stating straightforward facts, saying this is the threat, this is what could happen. None of that said. It's always this kind of, there were these, threats to the public. It's really unbecoming, actually, I think, for a minister of state to be so vague and suggestive when, clearly if those threats had been any part of the intelligence she'd had, the court is very unlikely to have ruled the way that it did, I would have thought. Thank God things were a little less frustrating and much more entertaining over on the BBC, where Laura Kunsberg pulled a little stunt.
The High Court said that your decision to prescribe Palestine Action, essentially say they're a terrorist group, the court found that that was wrong, that you'd have made a mistake in how you went about that. One of those who's been arrested, 83-year-old Church of England priest Sue Parfitt, she's been charged under the Terrorism Act for holding a placard up supporting Palestine Action. We spoke to her yesterday and she has a message for you.
I do not consider myself a terrorist. It is quite ludicrous to consider that I am. I'm an Anglican priest and I have worked for peace and justice all my life. This is not what terrorism is. We know what terrorism is. It is people like Al-Qaeda and people who have done terrible acts against communities.
You got this wrong, didn't you?
Well, the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, has looked at this and been very clear. She disagrees with the judgment and is appealing against it.
That was the legend Sue Parfitt there, spitting facts, basically. Cooper referred to Shabana Mahmood, the current Home Secretary, deciding that asking to appeal this decision. But look, if I were her, I think I'd be seriously calculating the costs of carrying the can for Yvette Cooper any further, especially as the media seems finally to have turned against the whole idea of banning Palestine Action. On Friday, The Guardian ditched a more tepid editorial line to declare the court ruling a humiliating blow for ministers. The Times has called the ban on Palestine Action excessive and has urged ministers to move on. And even The Telegraph called the prescription a clumsy response, saying it looked ridiculous. Telegraph getting things right for once. Kieran, what do you think is going to happen next? What should happen next?
Well, what can you even say after Sue Parfitt? There isn't much more. All roads go cold. But I would say, in terms of what happens next, look, in the long term, I think that in 100 years or 200 years, this will genuinely, I believe this will be regarded as one of the worst pieces of legislation ever passed in the 1,000-year history of the Houses of Parliament. I really, truly believe that. And we said it countless times on this show that not long ago that the Palestine Action hunger strikers will be regarded one day as we regard the suffragettes today. I didn't expect it to happen quite so quickly. I'm not saying that that's how they're regarded yet by a mainstream of public opinion, but it's, things are moving very quickly because it was such a disastrous, self-defeating, pathetic, snivelling attempt by the government to wedge through legislation that they thought would please the Israel lobby and the arms manufacturers and gain them political capital. It's obviously done the perfect opposite of that. What happens next is, look, I don't think people in politics or whatever commentary should make too many predictions about the future, but I do think that this, if it goes to the Supreme Court, the government will be defeated. And I don't know. I strongly hope that all of the hunger strikers and all of the Bryce Norton and all of the Filton 24 will be completely acquitted. I don't know if that will be the case, but I suspect things are turning in their, and by extension, our favour.
One of the great shocking things about the prescription when it happened, I mean, I couldn't really believe it was going to happen, until it did, because it's so draconian, right? And, just days before, I believe, there was a sort of memorial for the suffragettes and there was Yvette Cooper, like posing for a picture. And the prescription, and I don't think she understood this, or maybe she did understand it and she didn't give a shit, but the prescription essentially then sets a precedent, if it was allowed to stand, that the suffragettes would be prescribed, right? The suffragettes under Yvette Cooper's regime would not be allowed to continue with their work of bringing gender justice, gender equality into society in the UK. So it was, for me, it was like the precedent that was uncaringly being set by the Home Secretary being allowed to now prescribe groups for property damage, which is what the judgment says she did. She prescribed them on the basis of property damage, but also because prescribing them would be a tool of shutting them down, which was something she was not supposed to consider. Cynical stuff.
Yeah, that's how liberalism works. Time time vindicates all, and the suffragettes who actually killed people, by the way, and blew up a chancellor's house, they are now liberal poster people, and you know, I'm glad that they're celebrated, but you're absolutely right. It's a sign of how things become easier in retrospect. One day everyone will have been against this.